Imagine this. Imagine a ship. Not a boat, not a plane, not even the International Space Station. Imagine something so massive, so unbelievably enormous, that it makes every structure humanity has ever built look like a child's toy. This ship is 8 kilometers long, 2 kilometers wide. It weighs more than every aircraft carrier ever constructed combined. And inside this colossal vessel, 10,000 human beings are living, breathing, eating, sleeping, fighting, loving, and dying. They have been doing this for over 100 years, and they will continue doing this for another 100 years before anyone on board ever sees their destination. This ship left Earth before anyone currently alive was born. It will arrive at a distant star system long after everyone currently alive has turned to dust and been recycled through the ship's biological systems to grow the next generation's food. This is a generation ship. This is humanity's boldest dream. And right now, inside this magnificent monument to human ambition, people are killing each other. Not because they are evil, not because something went wrong with the mission plan, not because of some alien attack or catastrophic system failure. They are killing each other because they are human. And being human, trapped inside a metal world with no escape, no horizon, no possibility of walking away, is the single most dangerous situation our species has ever faced. Now here is what is going to haunt you. This is not science fiction speculation. This is not a guess. This is what happens every single time you put human beings into a closed, confined, resource-limited environment and ask them to cooperate across generations. Every single time. We have the data. We have the history. We have the psychology. We have the biology. And every single piece of evidence points to the same terrifying conclusion. Civil war on a generation ship is not a risk to be managed. It is not a problem to be solved. It is a guarantee. It is as certain as gravity pulling you toward the floor. And today, we are going to prove it. Not with hand-waving, not with movie references, with science, with documented history, with peer-reviewed research, with the cold, hard math of human nature pressed against the unyielding walls of physics. But before we begin this journey, let me drop something on you that should make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. In 1991, a group of scientists sealed 8 people inside an artificial closed ecosystem in the Arizona desert. 8 people, carefully selected, highly educated, deeply motivated. They all shared the same goal. They all volunteered. They all knew what they were getting into. And within months, those 8 people had split into 2 hostile factions that could not stand the sight of each other. They stopped speaking. They stopped making eye contact. One crew member reported being spit at by a colleague, by someone she was supposed to trust with her life. 8 people in less than 2 years. Now multiply that by 10,000 people and multiply that by 200 years. And tell me civil war is not guaranteed. Tell me that with a straight face. I dare you. And here is another one. In 1790, 9 British sailors from the famous mutiny on HMS Bounty landed on a tiny island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean called Pitcairn Island. They brought with them 6 Polynesian men and 12 Polynesian women. 28 people total, on an isolated island with no possibility of rescue, no possibility of leaving, and no external authority to keep the peace. Within 4 years, most of the men were dead, murdered, by each other. 28 people could not maintain a peaceful society on an island with abundant food, fresh water, and tropical weather. And we think 10,000 people can do it inside a metal tube for 2 centuries. Think about that. Really sit with that for a moment. Then ask yourself the question that this entire video is built around. Is there something fundamentally incompatible between human nature and the generation ship concept? Is the dream of interstellar colonization actually impossible? Not because of engineering or physics, but because of us, because of what we are. If you are the kind of person who thinks deeply about these questions, you are in the right place. Subscribe right now, because what follows is the most thorough, scientific analysis of this problem you will find anywhere. Drop a comment telling me your gut reaction. Do you think humans can hold it together across centuries in a sealed vessel? Or do you think we are doomed to tear ourselves apart? Tell me before you hear the evidence, and then let us see if you change your mind by the end. Let us start at the very beginning. What exactly is a generation ship? And why would anyone need one? The universe is enormous beyond human comprehension. Our nearest neighboring star system, Alpha Centauri, is approximately 4.37 light-years away. That sounds almost manageable until you translate it into a number that actually means something. 1 light-year is approximately 9.46 trillion kilometers. So Alpha Centauri is about 41 trillion kilometers from Earth. To put that in perspective, if you could drive a car at highway speed non-stop, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, it would take you roughly 48 million years to get there. The Voyager 1 spacecraft, the fastest human-made object to leave the solar system, traveling at approximately 63,000 kilometers per hour, would take about 73,000 years. Now, within the Alpha Centauri system, there is a small red dwarf star called Proxima Centauri, and orbiting it is a planet called Proxima Centauri b. Discovered in 2016, this planet sits within the habitable zone of its star, meaning liquid water could theoretically exist on its surface. It is the closest known potentially habitable exoplanet to Earth, 4.2 light-years away. Using the fastest propulsion technology currently available or under serious development, the Parker Solar Probe's maximum speed of roughly 700,000 kilometers per hour, a journey to Proxima Centauri would take approximately 6,300 years, even if we imagine vastly improved propulsion, say 5 to 10% the speed of light, which is far beyond anything currently achievable but theoretically possible. With advanced nuclear pulse or fusion drive technology, the journey would still take 42 to 84 years. And that is the nearest star. Most potentially habitable exoplanets are tens, hundreds, or thousands of light-years away. The reality is stark. Unless physics itself reveals loopholes we currently have no reason to expect, faster-than-light travel is not possible. Einstein's special relativity tells us that as an object approaches the speed of light, the energy required to accelerate it further approaches infinity. You would need literally infinite energy to reach light speed. This is not an engineering problem waiting for a clever solution. It is a fundamental property of the universe. So if humanity ever wants to reach another star system and establish a colony, there are only a handful of options. Cryosleep, where passengers are frozen for the duration of the journey, but we have absolutely no idea how to freeze a human being and revive them. And the biological challenges may be insurmountable. Uploaded consciousness, where human minds are digitized and transmitted, but this is so far from current capability that it belongs more to philosophy than engineering. And then there is the generation ship, a vessel so large, so self-sufficient, so complete in its systems that it constitutes an entire world. People would be born on this ship, live their entire lives on this ship, and die on this ship, generation after generation, until their distant descendants finally arrive at the destination. This is not a fantasy dreamed up by science fiction writers. Although science fiction has explored it brilliantly, the concept was first proposed seriously by rocket pioneer Robert Goddard in the 1920s. It was developed further by scientists throughout the 20th century. In the 21st century, organizations like the British Interplanetary Society and Project Hyperion have conducted serious design studies for generation ships. This is a concept that real scientists and engineers take seriously as potentially the only viable method for human interstellar travel. But here is where the conversation usually stops. Most discussions of generation ships focus on the engineering. How do you build a hull strong enough? How do you generate power for centuries? How do you shield against cosmic radiation? How do you create artificial gravity through rotation? These are genuine and formidable challenges, but they are solvable in principle. Given enough time, resources, and technological advancement, humanity could probably build a generation ship that works mechanically. The problem that nobody wants to talk about, the problem that makes engineers and physicists deeply uncomfortable because it is not their field, is the human problem. Can 10,000 human beings sealed inside a closed system for multiple centuries, with no possibility of escape, no external authority, limited resources, and mandatory cooperation, actually maintain a functioning, peaceful society? The answer, based on everything we know about human psychology, sociology, biology, and history, is no. And we are going to spend the rest of this video understanding exactly why. Let us begin with the human mind itself and what happens to it in confined, isolated environments. This is not speculation. We have decades of research on this exact question. because governments and space agencies have been studying it intensely. Antarctica is the closest thing on Earth to a deep space environment. During the winter months, research stations become completely isolated. No flights in or out. No supply runs. No evacuation possible. Just a small group of people, typically 10 to 50, sealed inside a station surrounded by darkness, extreme cold, and absolute emptiness for 6 to 9 months. Sound familiar? Psychologists have been studying the effects of Antarctic winter over since the 1950s, and the findings are consistent and disturbing. There is an officially recognized condition called winter over syndrome. Its symptoms include chronic depression, irritability, irrational hostility toward fellow crew members, cognitive impairment, difficulty concentrating, insomnia, and a particularly unsettling phenomenon called the Antarctic stare, a dissociative fugue state where a person simply stops, stares at nothing, and becomes temporarily unreachable. They are awake, but their mind has checked out of reality. A study published in the journal Frontiers in Psychology described how Antarctic researchers enter a state of what the researchers called psychological hibernation. This is a defense mechanism. The mind, overwhelmed by isolation and monotony, essentially powers down non-essential emotional and cognitive functions to conserve psychological energy. The researchers are not depressed in the clinical sense. They are hibernating. Their minds are going dormant to survive. And remember, these are not random people off the street. These are carefully selected scientists and support personnel. They volunteered. They were screened for psychological resilience. They knew what they were signing up for. They knew it was temporary. They knew they would go home. And still, their minds deteriorated. Still, irrational conflicts erupted. Still, small groups fractured into hostile subgroups. NASA has been using Antarctic stations as analog research environments for long-duration space missions since the 1960s. Their findings consistently confirm that isolation and confinement produce interpersonal conflict, even in the most carefully selected and rigorously trained teams. A meta-analysis of Antarctic psychosocial research conducted for NASA found that negative emotional states increase significantly over time in isolation. Positive emotional states decrease, and interpersonal tensions escalate predictably. Now, let us look at submarines, another confined environment that has been extensively studied. Submarine crews live in extremely tight quarters for deployments lasting 3 to 6 months. The psychological research on submariners, published in journals like Military Medicine and the Journal of Human Performance in Extreme Environments, documents a consistent pattern. Even in these relatively short deployments, crews experience what researchers call patrol fatigue, characterized by irritability, social withdrawal, reduced cognitive function, and interpersonal friction. A landmark 1969 study by G.S. Earls titled Human Adjustment to an Exotic Environment, the nuclear submarine documented significant psychological strain even among highly trained military personnel on relatively short deployments. Submariners develop what researchers call covert coping mechanisms, ways of managing emotional stress that are invisible to the crew but represent significant psychological labor. They bite their tongues. They suppress anger. They avoid conflict not because they feel peaceful, but because they know an explosion in a submarine is not metaphorical. But here is the critical difference between a submarine and a generation ship. Submarine crews know they will surface. They know there is an end date. They know that home exists, and they will return to it. This knowledge is itself a psychological survival mechanism. Take it away, and you take away the single most powerful tool the human mind has for enduring hardship: hope that the hardship will end. On a generation ship, for the vast majority of the population, the hardship never ends. They were born into it. They will die in it. There is no surface to reach. There is no home to return to. The ship is it forever. The psychological implications of this are staggering and unprecedented in human experience. And then there is Biosphere 2. If you want to understand why civil war is guaranteed on a generation ship, you must understand what happened in the Arizona desert in 1991, because it is the most important experiment ever conducted for the future of interstellar travel, and almost nobody talks about it in that context. Biosphere 2 was a $150 million, 3.14-acre sealed ecosystem built near Oracle, Arizona. It contained a miniature rainforest, a savanna, a desert, wetlands, a coral reef ocean, and an agricultural area. 8 people, 4 men and 4 women, were sealed inside on September 26, 1991, with the mission of living self-sufficiently for 2 full years. The goal was to study closed ecological systems, exactly the kind of system a generation ship would need. The crew included a botanist, a marine biologist, a physician, and other trained scientists. They were all deeply committed to the project. They had been involved in its planning and construction for years. They were not strangers thrown together. They were a team united by shared purpose, shared expertise, and shared excitement. What happened inside should terrify anyone who dreams of generation ships. Within the first few months, the group began to fracture. Not over personal grievances, although those existed. The split was over something far more fundamental. It was over governance, over the direction of the project. One faction of 4 wanted to change the project's management and shift priorities toward more scientific research. The other faction of 4 wanted to maintain the original leadership structure and mission parameters. This was not a petty argument. It was a philosophical divide about the fundamental purpose of their sealed world. Mark Nelson, one of the Biosphere 2 crew members who later wrote a book about the experience, described it in painful detail. The crew developed what psychologists call irrational antagonism. They split into 2 groups of 4 and essentially stopped functioning as a unified team. One crew member later recalled, "It was really pretty awful. I could be so cold to the people in the other group, walking by them and not even looking at them." Another crew member reported being spit at, twice, by a colleague she had worked alongside for years. And here is the part that should absolutely chill you to the bone. While this social fracture was tearing the crew apart, they were also slowly suffocating. The oxygen level inside Biosphere 2 dropped from the normal 20.9% to 14.2% over 16 months. That is equivalent to living at 15,000 feet altitude. Half the crew experienced symptoms of altitude sickness, including sleep apnea and cognitive impairment. Their doctor, who was inside the biosphere with them, reached a point where he could not add a column of numbers. They were literally losing the ability to think clearly. You might expect that a shared existential threat, like running out of oxygen, would unite the crew, that facing death together would burn away petty disagreements and force cooperation. It did not. The oxygen crisis actually intensified the conflict, because now there was something else to argue about. What caused the oxygen loss? Who was responsible? What should be done about it? Should they break the seal and accept outside help, effectively ending the experiment, or should they tough it out? The existential threat did not create unity. It created blame. It created recrimination. It created competing solutions championed by competing factions. Eventually, refrigerated trucks had to pump pure oxygen into the biosphere from outside. When the oxygen hit, the crew experienced what Nelson described as jubilation. They started running and laughing. One crew member said she felt like a born-again breather, but the social fracture never fully healed. The 2 factions maintained their division for the remainder of the 2-year mission. 8 people, carefully selected, highly motivated, sharing a common mission, in a beautiful, well-designed environment, with the knowledge that they could leave if things got truly desperate. And they could not hold it together. They split in half and nearly destroyed each other while simultaneously suffocating. Now I need you to perform a mental operation. Scale this up. Take the Biosphere 2 scenario and multiply it. Not by 2, not by 10, by over 1,000, 10,000 people instead of 8, 200 years instead of 2. No possibility of outside rescue. No trucks coming with oxygen. No door to the outside world. No exit. Ever. If 8 people fractured in months, what happens to 10,000 over centuries? The answer is not a mystery. The answer is written in every page of every history book ever written. The answer is civil war. Now, before you think this is just about psychology, let me take you deeper. Let me show you why the economics of a generation ship make conflict not just likely but structurally inevitable. A generation ship is what scientists call a closed system. On Earth, if your community runs out of food, you can trade with neighboring communities, migrate to more fertile land, import goods from across the ocean, or innovate new agricultural techniques using newly discovered resources. If your water supply is contaminated, you can find another source. If your air is polluted, you can move to cleaner regions. The Earth is an open system with redundancy built in at every level. A generation ship has none of this. Every molecule of oxygen, every drop of water, every calorie of food, every watt of energy exists in a fixed, finite quantity that must be recycled with near-perfect efficiency forever. There is no trade partner. There is no neighboring community. There is no new land to discover. There is no import, no export, no migration, and no new resources. What you have when you leave Earth orbit is all you will ever have until you reach your destination, which may be 200 years away. Think about what that means mathematically. If your recycling systems are 99.9% efficient, meaning they lose only 0.1% of material per cycle, that sounds phenomenal. But over the course of 200 years, with daily cycling of resources, those tiny losses compound. A 0.1% loss per cycle, cycled daily for 200 years, means you lose a staggering amount of total material over the mission lifetime. This means the ship must either carry enormous reserves or achieve recycling efficiency so close to 100% that any deviation is a crisis. And deviations will happen. Systems degrade, components wear out, unexpected chemical reactions occur, biological systems evolve and shift in unpredictable ways. The Biosphere 2 experiment demonstrated this vividly. Microbes in the organically enriched soil consumed oxygen and produced carbon dioxide at rates that nobody predicted. The unsealed concrete in the structure absorbed the carbon dioxide, effectively locking away the oxygen in a chemical form the crew could not breathe. A simple interaction between soil microbes and building materials nearly killed everyone. On a generation ship, these kinds of surprises will happen regularly over the course of centuries. And every time they happen, they create a resource crisis. And every resource crisis creates a political crisis, because someone has to decide how to respond, and their decision will benefit some people and harm others. Let us talk about food, because food is the most visceral and politically explosive resource on any generation ship. The Biosphere 2 crew grew 80% of their own food on a half-acre farm, and they were hungry constantly. Mark Nelson described losing 25 pounds and sometimes eating peanuts with their shells still on out of sheer desperation. Their doctor called their carefully managed diet a healthy starvation diet. They worked 3 to 4 hours every day, 5 days a week, just on farming, for 8 people. A generation ship carrying 10,000 people would need agricultural production on an industrial scale. Vertical farms, hydroponic systems, possibly lab-grown protein, insect farming, algae cultivation. All of these systems require energy, maintenance, expertise, and flawless operation. A single crop blight, a fungal contamination, a failure in the hydroponic nutrient delivery system. Any of these could reduce food production by 10, 20, 30% almost overnight. And when food production drops, someone has to decide who eats less. This is not a theoretical question. This is the most politically charged decision any leader can make. Throughout human history, food shortages have been the single most reliable trigger for social unrest and revolution. The French Revolution was sparked in significant part by bread shortages. The Russian Revolution of 1917 was preceded by severe food crises. The Arab Spring of 2011 was catalyzed partly by rising food prices. When people are hungry, they revolt. This is not a cultural phenomenon specific to certain societies. It is a universal human response. Hungry people will not peacefully accept rationing if they believe the rationing is unfair. And someone will always believe the rationing is unfair, because from any individual perspective, their own hunger feels more urgent than anyone else's. Water presents a similar challenge. Every drop of water on a generation ship must be recycled through wastewater treatment systems that convert human waste, agricultural runoff, and industrial byproducts back into potable water. These systems must operate continuously for centuries without catastrophic failure. Any contamination event, any system breakdown, any reduction in water quality affects everyone on the ship and requires immediate response. And the response requires decisions about priority. Who gets clean water first? The agricultural systems that produce food, the medical facilities that treat the sick, the leadership quarters, the engineering decks. Every allocation decision is a political statement about who matters more. And then there is energy. A generation ship's energy source, most likely nuclear fusion, powers everything. Life support, food production, lighting, heating, water recycling, manufacturing, communication, navigation, and artificial gravity through the ship's rotation mechanisms. Energy is not just a resource. Energy is the foundation upon which every other resource depends. Without energy, there is no air, no water, no food, no light, no heat, nothing. This means that whoever controls energy controls everything. The engineers who maintain the fusion reactors, the technicians who manage the power distribution grid, the administrators who allocate energy budgets, these people hold the ultimate power on a generation ship, not because they seized it, but because the physics of the situation hands it to them. They do not need weapons. They do not need armies. They just need to control the power switch. And this creates something that political scientists call structural inequality. Even if the ship launches with perfectly egalitarian principles, even if the founding constitution guarantees equal rights and equal access for all citizens, the functional reality is that some people's labor is more critical than others. An engineer who can repair the fusion reactor is more valuable to the ship's survival than a teacher or an artist or a farmer. This is not a moral judgment. It is a mathematical fact. And mathematical facts have political consequences. Over time, the people whose skills are most critical will accumulate more power, more privileges, more influence. They will not even need to demand these things. The system itself will provide them, because the system needs to incentivize the most critical workers to continue performing their duties. A fusion engineer who is unhappy and considering refusing to work must be appeased, because if the fusion reactor stops, everyone dies. A farmer who refuses to work creates a problem that takes months to become acute. An engineer who refuses to work creates a problem that takes hours. This means that within the first generation, possibly within the first decade, a de facto class system will emerge on any generation ship, not because anyone planned it, not because anyone wanted it, but because the physics of closed system survival creates structural power asymmetries that inevitably translate into social hierarchies. Those who control critical systems become the upper class. Those who perform necessary but replaceable labor become the working class. Those whose contributions are deemed least essential become the lower class. And here is the thing about class systems. They self-perpetuate. The upper class uses its power to ensure its children receive better education, better nutrition, better opportunities, and better access to the levers of power. Within 2 or 3 generations, the class boundaries harden. Mobility decreases. Resentment increases. The working class begins to see the upper class not as fellow passengers on a shared journey, but as exploiters who benefit from their labor while contributing less. The upper class begins to see the working class not as essential partners, but as a resource to be managed, a population whose demands must be contained. This is not speculation. This is the pattern of every human civilization that has ever existed. From ancient Mesopotamia to the Roman Empire to feudal Europe to industrial capitalism to modern nation-states. Social hierarchies form around control of critical resources. Those hierarchies calcify over time, and eventually the people at the bottom revolt. The specific circumstances change, the names change, the technology changes, but the pattern does not change, because the pattern is driven by human nature itself. Thomas Homer Dixon, a political scientist at the University of Toronto, spent decades studying the relationship between resource scarcity and violent conflict. His research, published in journals like the International Security Journal and summarized in his books Environment, Scarcity and Violence, demonstrates a clear causal pathway. When renewable resources become scarce in a closed or constrained system, and when the institutions managing those resources lack sufficient capacity or legitimacy, violent conflict becomes highly probable. He documented this pattern across dozens of case studies in developing nations. A generation ship matches every criterion in his model: permanent resource scarcity, constrained system, and institutions whose legitimacy will inevitably erode over generations. Now let us talk about the part that keeps space scientists awake at night, but rarely makes it into the public conversation. Governance. How do you govern a generation ship? What political system do you use? Because here is the terrifying truth. Every political system humanity has ever devised will fail on a generation ship. Not might fail, will fail. And I can prove it for each one. Let us start with democracy, because democracy is the system most people instinctively reach for when asked this question. Democracy is fair. Democracy gives everyone a voice. Democracy prevents tyranny. Right? On a generation ship, democracy faces problems that are not problems of implementation, but problems of fundamental incompatibility. Democracy works when the population can make meaningful choices about their collective future. But on a generation ship, the most important decisions have already been made and cannot be changed. The destination is fixed. You cannot vote to go somewhere else because the ship's trajectory and fuel supply are calculated for a specific target. The population plan is fixed. You cannot vote to allow unrestricted reproduction because the ship's life support capacity determines the maximum population. The resource allocation framework is fixed in broad terms by the physics of the closed system. The mission itself is fixed. You cannot vote to abandon the mission and just drift through space because the ship is designed for a specific destination and may not survive an indefinite journey. So what exactly does the democratic process control? Interior decoration, work shift schedules. These are not the decisions that matter. The decisions that matter, the ones people actually care about, the ones that affect whether you eat enough, whether you can have children, whether your children will be forced into a specific career. These decisions are made by physics and biology, not by politics. And when a population is told that they live in a democracy but cannot actually change anything that matters, the result is not contentment. The result is rage. The result is a population that feels lied to, manipulated, given the appearance of freedom while living in a cage. Kim Stanley Robinson, one of the most scientifically rigorous science fiction writers alive, explored exactly this scenario in his 2015 novel Aurora. He depicted a generation ship governed by democratic processes and showed in meticulous, scientifically informed detail how the system collapsed. When the ship's population discovered that their destination planet was uninhabitable, the democratic system could not resolve the fundamental disagreement about what to do next. Some wanted to try to colonize anyway. Some wanted to find another destination. Some wanted to turn around and go home. Democracy requires compromise, but there was no compromise available. The ship could not go to 3 different destinations simultaneously. The result was factional paralysis, followed by violent breakdown. So if democracy fails, what about authoritarianism? A strong central authority, a captain or a council with absolute power, enforcing the rules necessary for survival. This eliminates the paralysis problem. Decisions get made quickly. Necessary but unpopular policies get implemented efficiently. No wasted time on debate. The problems with authoritarianism on a generation ship are multiple and fatal. First, there is the well-documented psychological reality that power corrupts. This is not a proverb. It is experimentally demonstrated. The Stanford Prison Experiment, conducted by Philip Zimbardo at Stanford University in 1971, showed that ordinary college students randomly assigned to the role of prison guards began exhibiting cruel, authoritarian behavior within days. The experiment had to be terminated after just 6 days because the abuse had escalated so rapidly. Now imagine that dynamic playing out not over 6 days but over 6 generations. The founding captain may be a wise, benevolent leader. Their successor, raised in privilege, may be less so. Their successor's successor, born into a hereditary ruling class 3 generations removed from Earth, may be a tyrant. History is littered with examples. The Roman Empire, the Ottoman dynasty, the Romanov Tsars. Good founders are followed by mediocre heirs, who are followed by disastrous inheritors. Second, authoritarianism requires enforcement. You need a police force, a military, a security apparatus, and that apparatus itself becomes a power center. Who watches the watchman? If the security forces disagree with the civilian leadership, they can stage a coup. If they agree with the leadership, they can become instruments of oppression that drive the population toward revolution. Either way, the existence of an enforcement apparatus creates an inherent instability. Third, and perhaps most critically, is the succession problem. Every authoritarian system's most vulnerable moment is the transfer of power. When the leader dies or becomes incapacitated, there is a vacuum, multiple claimants, factional maneuvering, potential for violent seizure of power. In Earth-based authoritarian systems, this succession crisis occurs once every few decades. On a generation ship lasting 200 years, it would occur many times. Each succession is a potential civil war trigger. Well then, what about technocracy? Rule by the technically competent, the people who understand the ship best. The engineers, the scientists, the systems managers should make the decisions. This seems logical, especially in an environment where technical decisions are literally life or death. But technocracy has its own fatal flaws. Technical expertise does not confer social wisdom. The best fusion engineer in the world may be a terrible mediator of interpersonal conflicts. A brilliant botanist who maximizes crop yield may be utterly incapable of making fair decisions about food distribution during a shortage. Technical people are trained to solve technical problems, not human problems. And on a generation ship, the technical problems are actually the easy part. The human problems are what kill you. Moreover, technocracy creates a permanent intellectual aristocracy. If governance is limited to those with technical expertise, and technical education is limited by capacity and aptitude, then a large portion of the population is permanently excluded from any role in governance. They are governed by people they did not choose, making decisions they do not understand, based on criteria they cannot evaluate. This is not governance. This is benevolent dictatorship with a lab coat instead of a crown, and it generates the same resentment that every other form of unaccountable power generates. What about religion? Some researchers and theorists have suggested that a carefully designed ship religion could provide the social cohesion necessary to hold a generation ship together. The mission itself could be framed as sacred. The founders could be elevated to the status of prophets. The destination could be portrayed as a promised land. Rituals and ceremonies could mark the passage of time and reinforce collective identity. Religious frameworks have held communities together for millennia on Earth. But here is what every single religious tradition on Earth also demonstrates. Religions splinter, they evolve, they generate heresies, reformations and schisms, and they do so with absolute predictability, because religious texts and traditions must be interpreted, and interpretation is always influenced by contemporary circumstances. Christianity split into Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic within a few centuries of its founding. Protestantism then fragmented Christianity further into thousands of denominations. Islam split into Sunni and Shia within decades of the Prophet Muhammad's death. Buddhism divided into Theravada and Mahayana branches. Judaism produced Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox movements. Every major religion has undergone this process because every major religion faces the same fundamental problem. The founders are gone, the original context has changed, and the current generation must interpret the founding principles for their own time. On a generation ship, a founding religion would undergo this exact same process. Within 3 to 5 generations, interpretive disputes would arise. What did the founders really mean by their commandments? Which rules are literal and which are metaphorical? Can the rules be changed to accommodate new circumstances? A schism would develop, and religious schisms are the most dangerous kind of social fracture because they involve identity, meaning, and the perception of absolute truth. Political disagreements can be negotiated. Religious disagreements cannot, because both sides believe God or cosmic destiny is on their side. Perhaps you are thinking, fine, then we will write a perfect constitution before departure, a comprehensive legal framework that covers every possible scenario with built-in mechanisms for amendment and adaptation. Surely the rule of law can provide stability where politics and religion cannot. Consider this. The United States Constitution, widely regarded as one of the most carefully crafted governing documents in human history, is just over 200 years old. In that time, it has required 27 formal amendments and tens of thousands of judicial interpretations. It has been the subject of a devastating civil war. It has been weaponized by every political faction to justify their preferred policies. Constitutional interpretation in America today is so contentious that it is a central issue in every presidential election and every Supreme Court nomination. Originalists argue that the Constitution means exactly what its authors intended. Living document advocates argue that it must be interpreted in light of contemporary values. This debate has been raging for over 200 years and shows no sign of resolution. On a generation ship lasting 200 years, this exact dynamic would replay, the ship's constitution would become a political battleground. Factions would form around competing interpretations. Originalists would insist that the founders' vision must be preserved unchanged. Reformists would argue that the founders could not have anticipated current circumstances, and the rules must adapt. Both sides would claim constitutional legitimacy. Both sides would accuse the other of betraying the founding principles. And when constitutional disputes cannot be resolved through legal mechanisms, they are resolved through force. There is a deeper problem here, one that underlies all these governance failures. It is the problem of consent. On Earth, political philosophers from John Locke to Jean-Jacques Rousseau have argued that legitimate government derives its authority from the consent of the governed. Even in imperfect democracies, there is at least the theoretical possibility of consent. You can vote, you can protest, you can emigrate, you can run for office, you can, in extreme cases, join a revolution and establish a new government. On a generation ship, the children born after departure never consented to anything. They did not choose the mission. They did not choose the destination. They did not choose the governance system. They did not choose the rules about reproduction, career assignment, resource allocation, or anything else. They were born into a sealed world designed by ancestors they never met, heading toward a destination they may not want to reach, governed by rules they may find unjust, with absolutely no possibility of exit. The philosopher Neil Levy, writing in Aeon, articulated this with devastating clarity. A generation ship, he argued, is fundamentally a feudal system. You are born into a prescribed purpose. You cannot move or leave. You will be constrained to work for a goal others chose. Your reproductive choices will be limited by the needs of the mission. Your career options will be limited by the needs of the ship. Your freedom of movement, association, and expression will be limited by the realities of a closed system. This is not freedom. This is serfdom with better technology. And when people feel that they are serfs, when they feel that their lives are determined by forces beyond their control, and their consent was never asked, they resist. This is not a personality trait of difficult individuals. This is a fundamental feature of human psychology. Self-determination theory, one of the most well-supported frameworks in motivational psychology, demonstrates that humans have a deep innate need for autonomy. When autonomy is thwarted, the result is not acceptance but defiance. When defiance is suppressed, the result is not compliance, but rage. And when rage has no legitimate outlet, the result is violence. Now I need to take you somewhere even deeper, into the hard wiring of the human brain itself, into the evolutionary architecture that makes us who we are. Because even if you could solve the psychology of confinement, even if you could solve the economics of scarcity, even if you could find the perfect governance system, even if you could secure the consent of every generation, there is still a force operating at the most fundamental level of human biology that pushes relentlessly toward conflict. And that force is tribalism. We are tribal creatures. This is not a metaphor or a moral judgment. It is a biological fact. Homo sapiens evolved in small bands of hunter-gatherers, numbering approximately 50 to 150 individuals. This is the environment in which our social brain was shaped over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. Our neurological hardware is optimized for this scale of social organization. Robin Dunbar, an anthropologist and evolutionary psychologist at Oxford University, proposed what is now known as Dunbar's number, the theoretical cognitive limit on the number of stable social relationships a human being can maintain. Based on the size of the human neocortex compared to other primates, Dunbar calculated this number at approximately 150. This number appears repeatedly across human social organizations: hunter-gatherer bands, Neolithic farming villages, Roman military units, Hutterite colonies which split when they reach about 150 members, average personal social networks. The number 150 appears again and again because it reflects a genuine cognitive constraint. On a generation ship carrying 10,000 people, you can maintain meaningful social relationships with about 1.5% of the population. The other 98.5% are strangers. Not just strangers in the sense that you have not been introduced. Strangers in the deep evolutionary sense. They are outside your tribe. They are, from the perspective of your Stone Age brain, the other. And here is what your Stone Age brain does with the other. Research by MacDonald, Navarrete, and Van Vugt, published in 2012 in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. documented what they call the male warrior hypothesis. Throughout human evolutionary history, coalitions of males competed with other coalitions for territory, resources, and reproductive access. This competition was violent, frequent, and consequential. The men who were better at forming aggressive coalitions, identifying outgroup members, and mobilizing for intergroup conflict left more descendants. Natural selection, in other words, bred us for tribal warfare. This is why humans so readily categorize other people as us versus them based on the most minimal cues. It is why national flags, team jerseys, religious symbols, and political party affiliations trigger such intense loyalty and hostility. It is why genocide can occur between groups that are genetically, linguistically, and culturally almost identical but happen to identify with different labels. The tribal instinct does not require real differences. It creates perceived differences out of whatever material is available. On a generation ship, the material for tribal division would be abundant. Which deck were you born on? Which section do you live in? What is your family's job assignment? What is your genetic lineage? Do you favor the mission or question it? Do you follow the original religion or the reformed version? Do you support the current leadership or oppose it? Each of these categories can serve as a tribal marker. And once tribal markers are established, in-group bias and out-group hostility follow as inevitably as thunder follows lightning. The male warrior hypothesis specifically highlights the danger posed by young men in a generation ship scenario. In every human society throughout history, young men are the demographic most likely to engage in violence, risk-taking behavior, and revolutionary action. Societies manage this demographic through a combination of outlets: military service, economic opportunity, frontier expansion, competitive sports, and the prospect of upward social mobility. A generation ship offers almost none of these outlets. There is no frontier to explore. There is no military enemy to fight. Economic opportunity is limited by the fixed structure of the ship's economy. Competitive sports can help, but they are a partial substitute at best. What you have on a generation ship is a continuous supply of young men, with no territory, limited reproductive choice, due to genetic management requirements, restricted career options, no external enemy, no possibility of emigration, and no prospect of a fundamentally different life. This is the demographic powder keg that has detonated in every confined, resource-limited, opportunity-poor environment in human history, from prison riots to urban uprisings to military mutinies to revolutionary movements. The pattern is the same. Young men without hope become young men with weapons. And this connects to a broader evolutionary reality about status hierarchies. All primate species, including humans, form dominance hierarchies. This is not a cultural artifact. It is a biological feature that predates human culture by millions of years. Even in intentionally egalitarian communities, informal hierarchies emerge rapidly. Studies of communes, kibbutzim, and other utopian communities consistently show that within months of formation, some individuals have more influence, more access to resources, and more social power than others. The hierarchy is not declared. It is not formalized. But it exists, and everyone knows their place in it. On a generation ship, the hierarchy will crystallize around control of critical resources. Engineers will outrank farmers, fusion technicians will outrank corridor cleaners, medical personnel will outrank food processors, leadership families will outrank labor families. And within a few generations, these functional hierarchies will harden into social classes that operate with the same self-perpetuating logic as aristocracies on Earth. The people at the top will use their position to maintain their position. The people at the bottom will eventually recognize this and resent it. Resentment will build. And when resentment builds with no outlet, it does not dissipate, it explodes. Let me tell you about perhaps the most terrifying aspect of all this, something that is unique to generation ships and has no parallel in any other human scenario: the generation gap. Not the ordinary generation gap that every family experiences, where parents and children disagree about music, or fashion, or values. This is something fundamentally different. This is a generation gap that accumulates over centuries, in which each successive generation is progressively more alienated from the mission that defines the ship's entire reason for existence. Think about the people who board the generation ship on departure day, Generation 1, the founders. These are people who chose this mission. They volunteered. They were selected from millions of applicants. They underwent years of training. They said goodbye to Earth with full knowledge of what they were sacrificing. They remember blue skies, oceans, forests, cities. They carry within them the culture, the values, the dreams that motivated the mission. They believe in the destination with the fervor of pioneers. For Generation 1, the mission is everything. It is the purpose that justifies every sacrifice. Generation 1 will also be the generation that establishes the governance structure, writes the constitution, designs the education system, creates the cultural institutions, and sets the norms that all subsequent generations are expected to follow. They do this with the best of intentions and the full authority of being the founders. And then they die. Generation 2 is raised by Generation 1. They hear the stories of Earth firsthand from their parents. They absorb the mission's importance through direct emotional transmission. They see the passion in their parents' eyes, but they themselves never saw Earth. They have no personal memories of blue skies or open oceans. Earth is their parents' home, not theirs. The ship is their home. The mission is still important to them, but it is one step removed from personal experience. It is inherited purpose, not chosen purpose. Generation 3 is raised by Generation 2. Their connection to Earth is their grandparents' stories, filtered through their parents' retelling. Earth is becoming mythological. The mission is becoming abstract. The ship and its routines are the only reality they have ever known. By Generation 5, Earth is ancient history. The mission is a doctrine handed down from ancestors who are essentially strangers. The values of the founders, shaped by Earth experiences that no one alive can relate to, feel increasingly arbitrary. Why do we follow these rules? Because the founders said so. But who were the founders? They were people who lived on a planet we have never seen, in a civilization we have never experienced, making decisions for a future they could not imagine. Why should their choices bind us? This is the question. This is the most dangerous question anyone can ask on a generation ship. And it is a question that every generation will eventually ask, with increasing urgency and decreasing patience for the answer. The sociological concept at work here is called cultural drift. Every culture changes over time. Language evolves. Values shift. Traditions morph. Artistic expression transforms. Religious interpretation adapts. No human culture in history has remained static for more than a few generations. Modern American culture is unrecognizable compared to 1776. Modern Japanese culture bears little resemblance to Edo period Japan just a few hundred years ago. Modern British culture would be alien to Victorians, let alone medieval Britons. On a generation ship, cultural drift occurs in a sealed container. The culture that launched from Earth will transform beyond recognition within a few generations. The language will evolve. New words will appear for ship-specific concepts. Old words will lose their meaning as the referents disappear. What does ocean mean to someone who has never seen water larger than a recycling tank? What does forest mean to someone who has never seen a tree taller than the agricultural section ceiling? What does freedom mean to someone who has never had a choice about where to live, what to do, or whether to have children? And as culture drifts, a devastating phenomenon begins: knowledge loss. Not all knowledge transfers perfectly from one generation to the next. Skills that are not practiced are forgotten. Information that is not actively used deteriorates. On Earth, this process is mitigated by the size and redundancy of the knowledge base. If one community forgets how to smelt iron, another community remembers. On a generation ship, there is no redundancy. There is one community. If critical knowledge is lost, it is lost forever. Robert Heinlein explored this scenario in his 1941 novel, Orphans of the Sky, where a generation ship's population lost all knowledge of their circumstances. They came to believe that the ship was the entire universe. The idea of planets, stars, and an outside was heresy. This is fiction, but it is based on a real phenomenon. Isolated communities do lose knowledge. Tasmanian Aboriginal people, isolated from mainland Australia for approximately 10,000 years, lost several technologies that their ancestors had possessed, including bone tools and fishing techniques. Knowledge does not maintain itself automatically. It requires active, deliberate, systematic transmission across every generation. And on a generation ship, any disruption to that transmission chain can result in catastrophic knowledge loss. Now here is where all these threads converge into the generation gap's most explosive implication. At some point during the mission, a significant portion of the population will challenge the mission itself. They will ask not just why should we follow the Founder's rules, but why should we continue the Founder's journey? Think about it from the perspective of a fifth-generation ship inhabitant. You were born on this ship. Everyone you know was born on this ship. Your entire world is this ship. You have been told your whole life that the purpose of your existence is to maintain the ship and eventually deliver your descendants to a planet orbiting a distant star. But you will never see that planet. Your children will never see that planet. The planet is for you entirely theoretical. It might be habitable, it might not. It might be a radiation-blasted wasteland. You do not know. Nobody knows. You are being asked to dedicate your entire life, and your children's lives, and your grandchildren's lives, to reaching a place that might kill everyone who sets foot on it. Meanwhile, the ship is here. It is real. It is home. You know how it works. You know how to survive in it. You could potentially live on this ship indefinitely if the population is managed and the systems are maintained. Why risk everything on an alien planet when you already have a functioning world? This is the logic that will produce the turn the ship around faction, or the stop the mission faction, or the stay on the ship faction. Whatever they call themselves, they will exist, and they will represent a substantial portion of the population. They are not crazy, they are not cowardly, they are not traitors. They are people making a rational assessment of their circumstances. The ship is known, the planet is unknown. The rational risk assessment favors the known. On the other side will be the mission loyalists, people who believe that the mission must be completed because the founders intended it, because the ship cannot sustain itself indefinitely, or because turning around or stopping would mean all the previous generations suffered for nothing. They too are not crazy. They too are making rational arguments. The problem is that both sides are right and both sides are wrong, and the decision is binary. The ship cannot simultaneously continue to its destination and stop. It cannot simultaneously land on the planet and remain in space. There is no compromise, no middle ground, no negotiated settlement. One side gets what it wants, and the other side loses everything. This single issue is sufficient to cause a civil war. But it is only one of many such binary uncompromisable issues that a generation ship will face over its lifetime. Here is another one, the arrival generation problem. Suppose the mission succeeds. Suppose the ship reaches its destination after 200 years. Suppose the planet is habitable. The final generation, the one that arrives, faces a crisis that no previous generation experienced. These people have lived their entire lives on the ship. The ship is their world, their home, their identity. They know every corridor, every compartment, every face. They have never stood beneath an open sky. They have never breathed unfiltered air. They have never felt natural wind or rain. They have never seen a horizon that was not a wall. The idea of living on a planet, exposed to weather, predators, bacteria, radiation, and the terrifying openness of an alien sky is not exciting. It is terrifying. And now they are being told to leave everything they know, everything they love, everything that feels safe, and descend to the surface of an alien world where anything could kill them. Many of them will refuse. Why would I leave my home for that? This ship has sustained my family for 200 years. I am not abandoning it. This creates a final bitter split. Those who want to complete the mission and colonize the planet versus those who want to remain on the ship. Both groups will claim legitimacy. Both groups will claim the right to the ship's resources. If the colonizers descend to the surface, do the ship dwellers get to keep the ship? If so, the colonizers lose their safety net. If not, the ship dwellers are being forced off their home. There is no clean resolution to this. There is only conflict. Now, let me ground all of this theory in concrete historical evidence, because everything I have described is not hypothetical. It has already happened over and over again in the closest historical analogues to generation ships that exist. I already mentioned Pitcairn Island, but let me tell you the full story because it is a nearly perfect microscale preview of what would happen on a generation ship. In 1789, Fletcher Christian led a mutiny against Captain William Bligh on HMS Bounty. After setting Bligh adrift, Christian and 8 fellow mutineers, along with 6 Polynesian men and 12 Polynesian women and 1 child, searched for a place to hide from the Royal Navy. They settled on Pitcairn Island, an extremely remote and isolated volcanic island in the South Pacific. It was the ideal hiding place, too small and too far from shipping lanes for anyone to find them. The colony started with 28 people. They had ample food from the island's fertile soil and surrounding ocean, fresh water from streams, timber for building, a tropical climate. By any material standard, they had everything they needed to build a peaceful, sustainable community. What happened instead was a catastrophe that would be absurd if it were not documented fact. The British mutineers immediately established a racial hierarchy. They divided the island's land among themselves and allocated none to the Polynesian men. They treated the Polynesian men essentially as servants and labourers. When 2 of the Polynesian women, who were partners of the British men, died in accidents, the British men took 2 of the Polynesian men's partners for themselves. The Polynesian men were now landless, partnerless, and subordinate. Their labour was exploited. Their dignity was systematically stripped. In September of 1793, 3 years after settlement, the Polynesian men revolted. In a coordinated attack, they killed 5 of the British men. The surviving British men then killed all the Polynesian men in retaliation, some with the help of Polynesian women who had grievances of their own. Over the following years, 2 more British men died, one from asthma and one murdered by another settler. By 1800, 10 years after landing, only 1 adult man remained alive, John Adams. Out of 15 adult men who landed on Pitcairn, 14 were dead, almost all from violence. This happened in a community of 28 people, with abundant resources, on an island with open skies, fresh air, and room to move, without the pressures of a closed life support system, without mandatory reproduction rules, without generations of accumulated grievance, without energy scarcity, without governance systems constraining every aspect of daily life. If 28 people with abundant resources and open space could not avoid a bloodbath that killed almost all the men within a decade, what chance does a generation ship have? The Pitcairn colony's failure follows the exact pattern predicted by the analysis we have built throughout this video. A privileged group established control over critical resources, including land and reproductive partners. A subordinate group was exploited and marginalized. Resentment built without any constructive outlet. Violence erupted when the subordinate group concluded that they had nothing left to lose. Retaliatory violence followed. The cycle continued until the community was nearly destroyed. And the pattern repeats across history. The story of long-duration naval voyages is essentially a catalogue of mutinies. Ferdinand Magellan's circumnavigation attempt in 1519 faced a mutiny attempt within months of departure. Henry Hudson, exploring for the Northwest Passage in 1611, was set adrift by his own crew and never seen again. The Bounty mutiny itself was triggered by perceived unfair treatment and resource distribution during a long, difficult voyage. The pattern is the same every time. Extended isolation, perceived unfair leadership, resource strain, and no external authority to mediate disputes. Generation ships combine all of these factors, multiply them by centuries, and add additional pressure points, including mandatory reproduction, caste-like social structures, cultural drift, and the impossibility of escape. The colonial parallel is equally instructive. Every colonial enterprise in human history has eventually produced an independence movement. The American colonies rebelled against Britain. Latin American nations broke free from Spain and Portugal. India threw off British rule. African and Asian colonies achieved independence through revolution or political struggle. The pattern is universal because the underlying dynamic is universal. A colony develops its own identity, its own interests, and its own sense of self-determination that is incompatible with continued subordination to a distant authority. On a generation ship, the distant authority is not a foreign country. It is the past. It is the founders. It is the mission design. It is the rules established by people who have been dead for generations. But the dynamic is identical. The current generation develops its own identity, its own values, its own assessment of what is best for its own survival and flourishing. And those values, shaped by the reality of life on the ship, rather than the memories of life on Earth, will inevitably diverge from the founder's vision. When the divergence becomes great enough, the current generation will declare independence, not from a country, but from a mission, not from a colonial power, but from the tyranny of the dead. Let me give you one more historical parallel that is particularly illuminating: the Amish. The Amish are a Christian community that has maintained a remarkably stable, intentionally restrictive way of life for over 300 years. They limit technology, education, and exposure to outside culture. They use intense social pressure, including the practice of shunning, to enforce conformity. They are deeply religious, deeply communal, and deeply committed to preserving their way of life across generations. And yet, even the Amish, with all their tools of social control, experience a defection rate of approximately 15 to 20%. Roughly 1 in 5 Amish young people during the Rumspringa period, when they are allowed to experience the outside world, choose to leave the community permanently. And the Amish have an advantage that a generation ship does not. The defectors can leave. They walk out the door, join mainstream society, and start a new life. Their departure relieves the social pressure created by their dissatisfaction. On a generation ship, dissenters cannot leave. They remain on the ship, their resentment intact and growing, their influence spreading to others who share their discontent. They become permanent internal dissidents. And permanent internal dissidents, in every political system throughout history, eventually become revolutionaries. Now we need to talk about something that adds a layer of biological inevitability to all the social and psychological factors we have discussed: genetics. The generation ship's genetic management requirements are not optional. They are existential, and they will become a source of conflict so profound that it may overshadow everything else. The 2018 study by Frédéric Morin at the University of Strasbourg and Camille Beloufi at Casques 4 calculated the minimum genetically viable crew for a 6,300-year journey to Proxima Centauri b, using an algorithm called Heritage, which simulates multi-generational missions including natural deaths, accidental deaths, catastrophic events that reduce the crew by a third, infertility rates, and inbreeding limitations. They determined that a minimum of 98 settlers, 49 breeding pairs, were needed for the mission to have a 100% chance of success. But this number assumes strict breeding rules. Partners cannot be related at all, 0 in breeding. Reproductive pairings must be managed across the entire mission duration to maintain genetic diversity. This means someone, or some algorithm, must decide who can reproduce with whom. Cameron Smith, an anthropologist at Portland State University, published a 2014 study arguing that a much larger population is needed. He recommended a minimum of 10,000 people, with 40,000 being a safer target, to account for catastrophic events, genetic drift, and the social factors that the purely genetic models do not capture. His reasoning was straightforward. A population of 98 people with perfect genetic management is a theoretical minimum. In practice, genetic management will not be perfect because human beings will not perfectly comply with reproductive restrictions. And when you factor in the social, psychological, and political realities of managing reproduction in a closed population for centuries, you need a much larger genetic buffer. Here is what this means in practice. On a generation ship, your reproductive choices are not your own. You cannot simply fall in love with someone and decide to have a child. Every potential pairing must be evaluated for genetic compatibility. Some pairings will be prohibited because the partners are too closely related, even if they have never met and have no emotional sense of kinship. Other pairings will be strongly encouraged because they maximize genetic diversity, even if the individuals involved have no attraction to each other. Population size must be tightly controlled. Too many people strain the life support system. Too few people reduce genetic diversity below safe levels. This means that some people will be told they must have children, even if they do not want them, and other people will be told they cannot have children, even if they desperately do. The number of children per couple will be regulated. The timing of reproduction will be managed. The genetic screening of potential pairings will be mandatory. Now think about how this feels from the inside. You are a young woman on a generation ship. You have fallen in love with someone. You want to have a family with this person. You go to the genetic management office and you are told, no, your genetic profiles are too similar. Your child would be at risk for reduced heterozygosity. You must partner with someone from Section 12 instead. Here are 3 genetically optimal candidates. Please select one. Or you are a young man who has decided that you do not want children. You have other priorities. You want to pursue engineering, or art, or simply live your life on your own terms? You are told no. The population model requires that you reproduce. Your genetic profile is particularly valuable because your lineage carries alleles that are underrepresented in the current population. You have been assigned a reproductive partner. You will have 2 children within the next 5 years. This is not dystopian fiction. This is the minimum genetic management required to prevent the population from collapsing through inbreeding depression and genetic drift. Without these restrictions, the population's genetic health degrades with every generation. Harmful recessive alleles become more common. Disease susceptibility increases. Fertility decreases. Within a few centuries, the population becomes genetically non-viable. But reproductive coercion, however scientifically justified, is one of the most explosive political issues in human history. On Earth, reproductive rights are considered fundamental human rights by the United Nations. Forced sterilization and forced reproduction are classified as crimes against humanity. Every regime that has attempted to control its population's reproduction, from Nazi eugenics programs to China's one-child policy to forced sterilizations in colonial and post-colonial states, has generated intense resistance, resentment, and often violent backlash. On a generation ship, reproductive control is not optional, it is existentially necessary. But the people being controlled will not experience it as a scientific necessity. They will experience it as tyranny, and they will be right. It is tyranny. It is tyranny justified by survival, but it is tyranny nonetheless. And the difference between justified tyranny and unjustified tyranny means nothing to the person whose reproductive autonomy has been taken away. Within a few generations, the genetic management system will become a political lightning rod. Those who have been denied reproductive choice will organize. They will frame the system as eugenics, and they will not be entirely wrong. They will argue that the Genetic Management Office is playing God, deciding which genetic lines continue and which are pruned. They will point out that the managers of the system inevitably make subjective decisions about which genetic traits are desirable and which are not. They will note that the children of the management class always seem to receive favorable genetic pairings. They will accuse the system of creating a genetic aristocracy. Whether these accusations are accurate or not, they will resonate. They will resonate because they touch something deeply personal. Nothing is more personal than the right to decide who you love and whether you have children. Taking that right away, even for the best of reasons, generates a level of resentment that cannot be contained by rational argument. You cannot convince someone to be happy about forced reproductive pairing by showing them a spreadsheet of allele frequencies. There is another genetic dimension to the conflict potential of a generation ship. Over many generations, even with managed breeding, the population will undergo genetic drift. This is a natural evolutionary process in which allele frequencies change randomly from generation to generation, especially in relatively small populations. Over 10 or 20 generations, the ship's population will become genetically distinct from Earth basiline humans. Not dramatically, but measurably. Different average heights, different disease susceptibilities, possibly different skin pigmentation, if the ship's lighting environment differs from Earth's solar spectrum. And if the ship is physically divided into sections with limited intermarriage, which is likely given the natural tendency toward geographic clustering of social groups, different sections may diverge from each other. Section 1 may trend towards slightly different physical characteristics than Section 5. Over enough generations, these differences become visible. And visible differences, however slight, become tribal markers. They become the basis for us versus them categorization. They become the fuel for prejudice. This is not racism in the Earth sense. It is tribalism, driven by evolutionary psychology latching onto the most readily available distinguishing features, and it adds yet another layer of conflict potential to an already volatile mix. Now, I want to talk about something that sounds abstract, but is actually one of the most concrete and immediate conflict drivers on a generation ship. Information. Who controls it? Who has access to it? And how it becomes a weapon. A generation ship's entire knowledge base is stored in digital systems. Every piece of scientific knowledge, every historical record, every technical manual, every cultural artifact that humanity chose to bring along, exists in electronic form on the ship's servers. This knowledge base is the single most valuable asset on the ship, more valuable than the fusion reactor, more valuable than the food supply, more valuable than the air. Because without knowledge, nothing else can be maintained. If you lose the technical manuals for the life support system, you lose the life support system. If you lose the agricultural knowledge, you lose the food supply. If you lose the medical knowledge, you lose the ability to treat disease. This means that whoever controls access to the ship's information systems holds the ultimate power. And power, as we have established, is never distributed equally for long. The temptation to restrict information access is enormous and will prove irresistible for any ruling group, because knowledge is the basis of both competence and resistance. If you restrict the general population's access to technical knowledge, you create a permanent underclass that is dependent on the technical elite for survival. They cannot challenge your authority because they literally do not understand the systems they depend on. But restricting information also creates ignorance, and ignorance breeds fear, superstition, and conspiracy theory. If the general population does not understand how the life support system works, they cannot evaluate whether it is working properly. They must trust the word of the technical elite. And when something goes wrong, as it inevitably will, they have no way to distinguish between a genuine technical failure and a deliberate manipulation. Did the food supply really decrease because of a crop blight? Or did the leadership divert food to their own quarters? Did the oxygen level really drop because of a system malfunction? Or is the leadership rationing air to punish a rebellious section? Without access to information, these questions cannot be answered, and unanswered questions become conspiracy theories. And conspiracy theories become political movements, and political movements, in a confined space with no outlet, become revolutions. Education is the battleground where this information war is fought across generations. Every generation ship must educate its children. But what do you teach them? This question is far more politically loaded than it appears. Do you teach them the full history of Earth, including wars, revolutions, genocides, and civil conflicts? If you do, you give them a detailed playbook for rebellion. They will read about the American Revolution and think, those people overthrew their distant rulers who made decisions without their consent. Sounds familiar. They will read about the French Revolution and think, those people overthrew an aristocratic class that hoarded resources while the common people starved. Sounds familiar. They will read about slave rebellions and think, those people were born into a system they never chose, assigned roles they never wanted, and denied the right to determine their own future. Sounds very familiar. Do you censor the history? Remove the parts about revolution and rebellion? If you do, you create a population that is historically illiterate, and therefore poorly equipped to understand the social dynamics unfolding around them. You also create a time bomb, because censored information has a way of resurfacing. When it does, the population does not just learn the censored content, they also learn that they were being lied to. And the discovery that your government has been lying to you is one of the most radicalizing experiences possible. Do you limit education to job-relevant technical skills? Only teach engineers about engineering. Only teach farmers about farming. Only teach administrators about administration. If you do, you create a deliberately fragmented population, where no one has a complete picture of how the ship works. This may seem like a security measure, but it is actually a profound vulnerability. If no individual and no group understands the whole system, then coordination becomes impossible, and a generation ship requires coordination at every level to survive. There is no correct answer to the education question. Every choice creates vulnerabilities, every choice creates resentment, and every choice will be challenged by subsequent generations who believe the previous generation made the wrong call. Surveillance is another dimension of the information war. To prevent conspiracy, rebellion, and sabotage, the ship's leadership will almost certainly implement surveillance systems, monitoring communications, tracking movement, analyzing social networks for signs of organized dissent. This is a rational security measure. A single act of sabotage on a generation ship, a bomb in the water recycling plant, a poison in the agricultural system, a virus in the life support software, could kill everyone on board. The stakes are existential. The temptation to surveil is overwhelming. But surveillance breeds exactly the behavior it is designed to prevent. People who know they are being watched develop underground communication networks. They speak in codes. They meet in surveillance blind spots. They form secret organizations, The more invasive the surveillance, the more sophisticated the resistance becomes. This is not speculation. This is the documented history of every surveillance state in the modern era. East Germany's Stasi created the most comprehensive domestic surveillance apparatus in history. It did not prevent dissent. It drove dissent underground, where it became more organized, more radical, and more determined. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, the accumulated suppressed rage of decades of surveillance erupted in a revolution that destroyed the state entirely. Propaganda is the final dimension. To maintain mission commitment across generations, the ship's leadership needs a narrative, a story that explains why the mission matters, why the sacrifices are worthwhile, why obedience to the rules is necessary. This narrative will be taught in schools, reinforced through cultural institutions, celebrated in rituals and ceremonies, and embedded in every aspect of daily life. In other words, propaganda. And propaganda works. For a while, maybe for 2 or 3 generations, but propaganda has a shelf life. It works as long as the narrative roughly matches the population's lived experience. When the gap between the official story and daily reality becomes too wide, propaganda loses its power. When the official story says we are all equal partners in a glorious mission, but daily reality says some people eat better than others, live in better quarters, have more freedom, and make all the decisions, the population stops believing the story. And when they stop believing, they do not simply become apathetic, they become angry, because now they understand that they have been manipulated. The propaganda that was supposed to inspire loyalty instead becomes evidence of betrayal. Every revolution in human history has been preceded by a crisis of legitimacy, the moment when the population stops believing that the existing order is just. On a generation ship, this crisis is not a question of if, but when. And when it comes hard, because the stakes are absolute and the options for peaceful transition are minimal. So now we've established why civil war is guaranteed on a generation ship. We have covered psychology, resource scarcity, governance failure, evolutionary tribalism, generational drift, genetic management conflict, and information warfare. Each of these factors alone creates significant conflict risk. Together, they create certainty. But let me make it even more concrete. Let me walk you through the specific trigger points, the specific scenarios that would actually ignite the war. Because understanding why conflict is inevitable is one thing. Understanding how it starts is something else entirely. Trigger Scenario 1. The system failure, one of the ship's critical life support systems, suffers a partial failure. Perhaps the primary food production module experiences a contamination event that reduces output by 30%. This is not a hypothetical. Biological systems are inherently unpredictable over long timescales. A new pathogen could evolve within the ship's ecosystem. A chemical imbalance in the hydroponic nutrient solution could devastate crops. A failure in the UV sterilization system could allow fungal growth to spread through the agricultural section. The immediate consequence is food rationing. Someone must decide who gets less. The leadership announces that all sections will receive proportionally reduced rations. But Section 7 notices that Section 1, where the leadership lives, still has green vegetables that have disappeared from everyone else's meals. Whether this is true or a rumor does not matter. What matters is that people believe it. And when hungry people believe that their leaders are hoarding food, the result is not polite petition. The result is violent confrontation. The engineering team works to repair the failed system, but repair takes time, weeks, maybe months. During that time, rationing intensifies. People are hungry. Hungry people are irritable, irrational, and prone to violence. The leadership's security forces are deployed to maintain order, which means armed personnel are now visibly patrolling the corridors of the residential sections. The population interprets this not as protection but as oppression. Clashes occur, someone is killed, either a civilian by security forces or a security officer by a mob, and now you have a martyr. And a martyr is the most powerful catalyst for revolution ever discovered. Trigger Scenario 2. The succession crisis. The ship's captain, or council leader, or chief administrator dies unexpectedly. The succession protocol designates their deputy as the new leader, but a significant faction of the population does not recognize the deputy's authority. Perhaps the deputy is from a section that is already distrusted. Perhaps there is a rival claimant from a different faction who argues that the succession protocol was improperly established or has been corrupted over time. The ship now has two competing claims to legitimate authority. Each is backed by a portion of the population and, critically, a portion of the security forces. The security apparatus splits along factional lines. Each claimant declares themselves the lawful leader and the other an illegitimate usurper. This exact scenario has played out hundreds of times in human history. The Roman Empire's crisis of the 3rd century, the Wars of the Roses in England, the Chinese Warring States period, the Ottoman Empire's succession crises. Every time, the result is the same: civil war. Trigger Scenario 3, the discovery. The ship's long-range sensors detect that the destination planet, the planet the ship has been traveling toward for 150 years, shows signs of being uninhabitable. Perhaps the atmosphere has a composition that was not detectable from Earth's distance. Perhaps a stellar event has altered the planet's conditions since the ship departed. Perhaps the original data was simply wrong. The mission, the entire reason for the ship's existence, is now in question. What do you do? One faction argues that the ship should continue to the target star system and evaluate other planets or moons in the system. Another faction argues that the ship should alter course toward a different star system detected by updated surveys. A third faction argues that the ship should turn around and go back to Earth. A fourth faction argues that the ship should abandon the mission entirely and continue as a permanent habitat. Each option has profound implications. Continuing to the target system means another 50 years of travel, with no guarantee of a habitable destination. Altering course to a different star means potentially centuries more of travel. Turning around means admitting that the entire mission was a failure, and that every generation since departure lived and died for nothing. Becoming a permanent habitat means abandoning the founding mission and redefining the ship's entire purpose. There is no democratic process that can resolve this. There is no authoritarian decree that will be accepted. There is no technocratic solution that satisfies everyone. The population will split along lines of conviction, and each conviction is backed by rational argument. The result is factionalism, so intense that it can only be resolved by force. Trigger Scenario 4, the message from Earth. After 100 years of travel, the ship receives a transmission from Earth. The message says that Earth has developed a new propulsion technology. A faster ship has been launched and will arrive at the destination planet before the generation ship does. The implications are devastating. The generation ship's entire purpose, colonizing the destination planet, will be accomplished by someone else before they arrive. 100 years of sacrifice, multiple generations of lives lived and lost in service to the mission, have been rendered meaningless. They will arrive at a planet that is already colonized. They will be immigrants, not pioneers, visitors, not founders. The psychological impact of this news would be catastrophic. The mission loyalists would have the foundation of their worldview destroyed. The skeptics would be vindicated. The existing governance structure, which derives its legitimacy from the mission, would lose all authority. Every sacrifice, every restriction, every denied freedom, every forced reproductive pairing, every curtailed education, every enforced career assignment, all of it was for nothing. The destination was never theirs. It was just a direction. The rage this would generate is almost unimaginable, and rage without direction is a wildfire that burns everything.